It's time for Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
Today's special word is Gnosticism.
We know that Gnosticism comes from the Greek word for gnosis or knowledge. The Gnostic heresy was one that was around in the first century. Gnosticism is about a special knowledge. It's about immediate knowledge. And when I say immediate knowledge, I don't mean right now knowledge. I mean knowledge that doesn't have to be mediated through a source. Knowledge that doesn't have to be mediated through the Word of God. Immediate knowledge. Intuitive knowledge. A knowledge that separates insiders from outsiders.
This is Wretched Radio. That was Dr. Voddie Baucham helping us to understand an ancient concept called Gnosticism. Special knowledge. I know stuff you don't. And if you're asking, well, what does that have to do with the evening news? The answer is, a lot.
I use that phrase, ethnic Gnosticism, to sort of explain the phenomenon of people believing that somehow because of one's ethnicity, that one is able to know when something is racist. I remember back, I don't know, in the 90s, I think, there was a saying, it's a black thing you wouldn't understand, right? And the idea is that, you know, if I go to a restaurant and I sit down at the restaurant and somebody looks at me a certain way, or if I'm shopping in a store and the clerk looks at me a certain way, or if I'm pulled over by a police officer and the police officer addresses me in a certain way, I know when it's racism. And you can't tell me it's not. And even if you do or say something to me, I know if it's racism, and you can't tell me it's not. And in fact, if you do something or say something to me, and I know that it's racism, and then you come back and say, well, no, that's not what I meant, that's just your privilege speaking. Because according to the concept of white privilege, you don't know what you don't know.
Does that sound familiar? Most certainly does. That is happening a lot in our culture. Dr. Voddie Baucham coining the term ethnic Gnosticism, that people of particular ethnic groups, they have a special knowledge that others don't. And it is a knowledge about themselves. And this is an idea that is truly persuasive in keeping the battle lines drawn. Last night, we went to a restaurant celebrating a family birthday. We were actually sitting in a bubble. I'm not kidding. This particular restaurant opening up, courtesy of Herr Fauci. We were put inside of a plastic. The booth has plastic around it now, and only one side where you can actually speak to the waitron, because there are no waiters or waitresses, to the waitron. You could talk to there, but you couldn't. You were like John Travolta, stuck in your bubble. Now, apparently, I didn't know this about COVID. It actually hits plastic and dies, or just falls to the floor and it can't get you, because it wouldn't jump over like the top,
or go under.
Or it wouldn't come through the actual opening.
Yeah, no.
So apparently, we were perfectly safe, and I don't know why, but one of my daughters was saying, I think that woman is like upset with me because I touched the plastic. She keeps looking. Now, what was that woman thinking? And the answer at the table was, don't know. Maybe she overheard us say something she didn't like. Maybe she overheard us say something she did like. Maybe she knew one of us sitting at the table and was just looking to get a second glance. You know how you do that? We didn't know. Ethnic Gnosticism says, I do. I do know what you're thinking, even when you don't know what you're thinking. Now, explained like that alone, on the surface of it, keeping ethnic groups out of it, keeping histories out of it, keeping any genuine injustices out of it, ask yourself the question, is that a biblical idea? That I can know your heart? Bible tells me I can't even know my own heart. I need help from people drawing it out. What's bubbling down there? I can't know my own heart. It's so deceitful and wicked. And yet, ethnic Gnosticism, to use Voddie's term, it says, I can know what's going on in your heart, even if you don't, because you actually can't.
You don't know what you don't know, but I do. That's ethnic Gnosticism. This idea that somehow, because of my ethnicity, because of my position as a minority, I know what oppression is and feels like, and don't have to necessarily have evidence for it. And because of other people's position of not being minorities and not being oppressed, they actually oppress people without thinking about it and without knowing it. They have privilege that they're not even aware of. And literally the phrase is, you don't know what you don't know. So you have to be taught how racist you are, but nobody has to teach me when you're racist.
If you do not think this hasn't made its way into the church, as we speak, there are countless churches that are having, quote, the hard conversations, informing white people about something they did not know about themselves heretofore, that they are all racist. Now, here's where it does get a bit dicey. The Bible teaches us we really all are, aren't we? Well, we are. We have superiority and pride, and we think that people of different skin colors or different sizes or shapes, or even it becomes increasingly petty. How much money they have, what their SAT score was, how they perform on a field. Those are all things that we use to determine, well, basically, here's what I've concluded. Nobody's as good as I am, because that is our bent. So that does exist. The issue, though, is, are we all acting like that? Is that something that is overtly being acted upon in a conscious way, or is it something that some of us hate and war against? It would be wrong to say all men are adulterers. Now, all men can lust. That doesn't mean they act on their lust. But ethnic Gnosticism seems to go further. You don't know that you're thinking that way. I do, because you actually are. And it really draws a line. And it keeps us so divided, doesn't it? And that raises another question. Where does this idea even come from?
It is rooted, I would argue, in cultural Marxism that reduces everything to race, class, sex, gender, that that divides people up, not like classical Marxism that divides people up into the bourgeois and the proletariat, between the haves and the have-nots, between those who control means of production and those who don't control means of production. But in cultural Marxism, you divide the world between those who establish and benefit from the cultural hegemony and everyone else who is oppressed by it because, for one reason or another, they are not part of that dominant group.
Cultural Marxism afoot again, which is why I would encourage you, my brother or sister, if you have been intrigued by these critical theory ideas, social justice concepts, because your heart is indeed compassionate, you do need to know, there's no doubt about this, that it definitely has roots in Marxism. Now, not full-blown Marxism, but nevertheless in a cultural Marxism. And it seeks to divide for the purpose of what? A dissemination of power and goods. Now, there are many, but we need to ask ourselves the question, so as a Christian, what then is my problem with the idea of ethnic Gnosticism, the idea that I've got to help people understand that they're racist internally, even though they don't know it? What's the problem here? Voddie Baucham helps.
You are a racist, bigot, homophobic, transphobic, everything else phobic person that you could possibly be, whether you're aware of it or not. Whether you belong to Christ or you don't. Because apparently Christ can transform us and deal with all other sorts of sins, but this one somehow evades the cross. And all people, whether they're Christian or not, are still suffering from this one.
And that is a big problem indeed, which is why I would encourage you, if you're trying to promote these conversations for the sake of waking white people up to their sinfulness, ask yourself the question, is this a biblical approach? This is Wretched Radio. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is